And I just turned around and I hauled ass out of there. I was done. I wasn't dealing with that.
The hypocrisy of the cult is one of the things that turned me away the quickest.
When I turned my headlights on, it turned and looked at us. And one of the things I remember the most were the eyes were glowing red.
I see an orb of light. It is just circling these steps like it is waiting for me.
And he begins to tell them that he saw a UFO. They're basically like, what are you talking about? That's 7 foot up on a tree, peeking around it. And that's where I saw the top of the muzzle, nose, and the eyes. As soon as I made eye contact with this thing, it felt like death.
Welcome back to Tinfoil Tells. I'm your host, Brandon Wright. Tonight's episode, we're going to be joined by Jaren and Matthew. They're the authors of Christ Before Jesus. Now, what this book entails is they've done a lot of research into the topic of Jesus and the New Testament. What they've been able to discover could be eye-opening for some, could be offensive, but as I've always said, try and keep an open mind. But before we bring them on, if you've ever had an experience and you'd like to be on an episode of Tinfoil Tells, you can send an email to tinfoiltellspodcast@gmail.com, or you can go to the website, tinfoiltells.com, and send a message there. There's a contact section. Just go there, and you can reach me that way too. Either way works for me, so just send your message, and we'll get you scheduled for a future episode. If you'd like to continue to help the podcast out, please share it around. Word of mouth is the best way to get the podcast out there to new listeners. With every new listener, there's a chance for a new guest. That means more episodes for you guys. You can also leave a 5-star review wherever you listen to the podcast at. If you listen on YouTube, make sure to share those videos around as well. There is some merch out now, so for anyone interested in sporting some Tinfoil Tells gear, the link for that is in the show notes. There's some shirts, a hat, some stickers. All those cool things will be available on the merch store. So again, check out the show notes for the link to that. You can also join the Patreon. It's $1.99 a month, but you get early access to all the episodes, plus ad-free content and some bonus content as well. It's worth checking out if that's something you're interested in. Make sure to follow us on the social medias, Facebook, Instagram, X. There's TikTok, there's a Threads. I don't really use hardly any of those besides Facebook and Instagram, but again, they are there. So if you want to reach out to me that way, follow along, talk with me, interact with others, that is the best way to do it. I'm also doing Tinfoil Tells After Dark on the last Thursday of every month. It'll be a live stream show exclusively on YouTube and Facebook. The episodes will then air the following Thursday on all the podcatchers. But if you want to take part in the live stream, just log in. Make sure to go to the YouTube and click the bell to subscribe and be notified whenever the live streams are going on so you don't miss out. You can join the discussions. If you have an experience you want to share, you can even hop on there and share with the audience. But I think now we're going to go ahead and bring Jaren and Matthew on. Been looking forward to talking with them. I hope you guys enjoy the episode. And again, this could be a controversial topic for some. So if this is something that you might be offended by, I recommend that maybe you just skip this episode. But at least if you do listen, keep an open mind. But on that note, sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. I'd like to take the time to welcome my guests tonight, Jaren and Matthew. Thanks for coming on here and talking to me.
Thank you very much for having us.
Yeah, we're happy to be here.
You guys reached out to me a while back about a book you were writing, and it kind of piqued my interest. So if you want to give a little background about yourselves, and then we can talk about the book that you have been writing.
Absolutely. So my name is Jaren, and I am the co-author of this book along with Matthew. And the book is Christ Before Jesus. We're I want to say that we're finished with it, but we're trying to put in as much recent data as possible, up to date, keep it up to date and everything. So it's officially coming out on March the 16th, onto Amazon and, print, ebook, even audiobook version. But we are still trying to iron out any kind of, typos or anything like that, and making sure all the information is up to date, and even still working on some citations. So definitely coming along. My background is in economics and statistics. That's what my degree is in. And then Matthew. He's got a couple degrees. Matthew.
Yeah, so I'm Matthew. I have a bachelor's in philosophy and religious studies minor and master's in public administration, which I used basically to, getting a job with that type of degree. And my job ended up doing a lot with database work, and that led into some of the tools we end up using in the book, so which we can talk about later. Yeah, it's been an interesting process writing the book. Do you want to talk about the gist of the book, Jaren, or?
Yeah. So in short, we present our theory, which is that not only do we find very compelling evidence that Jesus, as presented by the Bible, even in a historical sense, did not exist, but on top of that, we have a lot of evidence that suggests that there is not a single New Testament book that was written prior to the start of the 2nd century. And we have, theological and logical and textual evidences for this. And then finally, in our book, we present our case backed up by stylometry. And this stylometric analysis is ran for the first time ever on not only the New Testament, but on Greek texts for the first few centuries CE, and even going back to at least 1 century into BCE. It is the first of its kind, or I guess I should say the first of its magnitude, to actually include all these different texts and take a look at the New Testament.
Now, I had a question. You'd mentioned that you'd done all this research and everything into this. What made you, of all things to research, what made you want to start the book? What made you the research on Jesus? What led to that?
Well, I think it was just kind of curiosity. Matthew and I were both raised in Southern Baptist homes. And, I consider myself a Christian for the first 20 years of my life, 2021. And, I had, even though I was an atheist at a certain point, I had always assumed that there was a historical Jesus that the stories just kind of got attached to, and just kind of the supernatural elements got added to. But at a certain point, a couple of years back, Matthew and I were kind of talking, and we were talking about the idea of, what happened at the very beginning of Christianity. Because, even if Jesus did exist or didn't exist, doesn't, either way, Christianity exists. And so what did they see? What led them to believe what they believed and write down what they wrote? So it was just kind of jumping in and diving in because we were just curious. And I don't know if Matthew would have a different take on that, but that's at least where I started.
Yeah, I mean, if you wanted to trace it back all the way to our youth or childhood, I grew up in a multi-faith house and led to a lot of debates. And then at one point, I think early college, Jaren presented this case that Jesus didn't exist to me and a friend. And we kind of rejected it at the time because the mainstream theory is that there was a historical Jesus, even if, the miraculous parts of his life didn't happen. And then, like he's saying, a few years ago, it just kind of popped back up in our lives, and we were looking into it and noticed a few odd things. And those odd things led us to ask ourselves, is there a way to approach this that's more objective? Because a lot of these things rely on, theological arguments that it's a matter of opinion sometimes, or he said, she said, and that led us to get into stylometry, and kind of ball got rolling from there.
Well, there's been a lot of theories out there. I heard something before about the Bible, the New Testament wasn't written until 200 years after the supposed crucifixion of Christ. So it kind of made me wonder, who were writing these stories 200 years later the people that would have witnessed it wouldn't have been alive. But then even there's parts of the Bible, I think was Abraham was like 700 or something years old. I never understood like the ages when it came to the Bible. None of that stuff ever made sense to me. But no, I will say before we get into it or whatever, I know a lot of the listeners and a lot of things they relate to Bible stuff. And I've said it before that I'm not really a religious person. I don't really lean one way or the other. I would hope there's something, but I don't know. I'm not going to say I'm a Christian. I'm not going to say I'm an atheist or whatever. I'm a person. I try and do good.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
I
Yeah,
don't know. I'm not out there doing crimes or committing murders or whatever else. So
yeah,
hopefully if there is something that I'm rewarded sometime, I don't know, or we just die and we never know.
We've definitely heard the idea that, without God or without Jesus, where's your moral compass? You could go out and, commit a whole bunch of murder and stuff like that without God's laws and stuff, which first of all, there's obvious problems with that kind of thinking. But on top of that, I commit as much murder as I want, which is zero, but that I do. I commit as much murder as I like, and that's zero.
I know there will be people, if they ever find this episode, not so much the normal listening base, but like I know there's very religious types out there. They would try and use this as you guys were working for the devil. I have a feeling I know how certain groups are, and they've said that your work, your book, or whatever, this is work of the devil trying to disprove Jesus, and they're just going to dig their feet down in deeper just because that seems to be how they operate.
Right. Well, I will say that not only do we not believe in Jesus, we also don't believe in Satan. So yeah, I think we're good there.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different responses, to what we postulate. When we say something like, "Hey, we don't think that Jesus existed," we get a ton of responses. We get a ton of questions about it. And the way that our book is actually laid out, it is 50 different questions that get asked to us, the 50 most common that get asked to us whenever we talk about what we believe and talk about our particular theory. And we take each one of those questions and we give a response to it. And that's how the book is laid out. And the questions are categorized, like based on historians or based on the Gospels or the epistles or the stylometry, all these different things. We lay them out, we categorize them. And so it's pretty easy to read. And, it makes it to where, if you already know the answer to something, if you already know what some people say to, say, Josephus, the historian, then you can skip ahead to the next question. So we try to make it easier, try to make it digestible.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that it's not an atheist book per se.
Right.
It's focused on whether or not Jesus was a historical figure. The reason we named the book Christ Before Jesus is something that we found is that there were people who believed in a mythical Christ figure before the name Jesus and these historical stories got attached to it.
Right. Yeah. And that's probably the most eye-opening thing is that, a lot of people kind of fall prey to what we come up with in our book, what we named the synonym problem. The idea that when Christ or Christians are talked about, then that somehow means Jesus. That somehow means Jesus was real. When Christians just means, someone who follows a Christ or believes in a Christ, and a Christ is just a title. That's not a name. There were plenty of people who were considered a Christ. John the Baptist from the Bible, he doesn't have too terribly many scenes before he's killed by an overdose of guillotine. But point is, his followers, called the Mandeans, they considered him to be a Christ. So, yeah, I mean, you have a lot of people. You have a lot of people who are apparently following a Christ and calling themselves Christians, but they don't have a story of Jesus until much later.
Well, if you guys want to dive on in from the beginning, let's start it with it.
Absolutely. So the mainstream opinion of Jesus and the mainstream opinion of the Gospels or the New Testament is that, most historians, they assume that Jesus probably existed. You might run into a historian that says, oh, there is absolutely proof of Jesus, that kind of thing. But a lot of that is based on either old or faulty reasoning, possibly even circular reasoning, lots of times using the Christians themselves as sources for it, which doesn't really make much sense. But overall, historians and Bible scholars generally say that the first gospel to be written was the Gospel of Mark, and they claim that it was written roughly about 70 CE, which would have been right around the time of the siege of Jerusalem, because it talks about the destruction of the Jewish temple there in Jerusalem. And so historians, they say, hey, if it talks about the destruction of the temple, more or less, it can't be before 70, because that's when it happened. Because historians don't want to admit that there's a prophecy or someone's telling the future or something, which makes perfect sense. But of course, the Bible scholars, they want to move the authorship of Mark as early as possible. So they just kind of compromised and went with 70. But they've got Mark in 70, and then Matthew in about 80 or so, Luke in 85, and then John anywhere from 90 to 110, I think is the range that they typically give it. And then they say that the epistles of Paul, or the letters of Paul, were written prior to the Gospels by a few decades. And one of the things that kind of gets floated around is the idea that Jesus is just another demigod that takes from prior gods. So you've got like Egyptian gods like Horus and stuff like that, and people try to find parallels, like, he was born on December 25th, born of a virgin, had followers, resurrected, all kinds of stuff. And ultimately, we looked at a lot of that, and we were like, wow, there's a lot of this that just doesn't have any evidence for it. Like December 25th wasn't even a birth date given for Jesus in the Bible. So, while we didn't think that Jesus existed, we were finding that a lot of the arguments for why he didn't exist were kind of bad. So we needed to kind of look into it, a lot further. And ultimately, that's when we ran into a guy named Marcion, and I'll let Matthew kind of talk to you a little bit more about Marcion there.
Yeah, so Marcion is a name you won't really hear a lot, but he was a second century Christian theologian and author writing in around the 130s or 140s. And he comes from modern day Turkey in the north part, which was at the time called Bithynia and Pontus. And according to all of the church historians at the time and after, in 144, he was kicked out of the church in Rome after he went there for basically being a heretic. They labeled him a heretic. But when he left, he published 10 letters from Paul and his own gospel. And that doesn't sound too significant, probably, because, like Jaren just said, this is, decades after the other gospels supposedly came out. But there was a thing that stuck out in that some of the later historians claimed that Marcion said his was actually first, and that, he could prove it. But then the church leaders would say, oh, no, we can prove that ours actually came first. And it was kind of a he said, she said thing. So we're like, well, that's interesting, but I don't know if there's really anything to that. And we started looking into it a little bit more, and we came across some interesting little incidents in Luke, which is the gospel he supposedly stole, that would seem to indicate, based on the order of the events, that Marcion might have actually been the first. And if that's the case, Jesus dying around the year 30, the first gospel not coming out until around 140, 144, that range, you've got over 100 years before anyone writes a story of Jesus. And then the letter of Paul's coming around that time. That's really significant too, because that's supposed to be written within 10 or so years after Jesus died. It's really significant that this would all be there. And, we thought, well, if the Gospels had been around since, the year 70 to 80 or that range, we should see quotations from people in between the years 80 and 144. But it turns out there aren't any. And the ones that people claim there are, those texts actually date to 150s or later. So we just asked ourselves, is there any more objective way we can look at this other than going off of these two groups accusing each other of stealing each other's books?
Yeah.
And yeah, that's when we ended up with stylometry, and specifically a program called Stylo.
Yeah. More or less, a lot of our findings started to push a lot of these texts into the 2nd century. And that caused a problem, because if Jesus dies in roughly 30, and then all of a sudden you don't have anything else until the 2nd century, there's just a gap. And so a lot of the early church leaders, the church fathers, they just made people up. There's numerous people that are talked about that straight up didn't exist. And not only are they making them up, they're writing letters as these people. They're claiming that these people, taught this person or learned from this person or went to this place or started a church here, all kinds of stuff.
There's
it's wild.
Not to interrupt, but there's also like a big time gap in the supposed life of Jesus anyways, wasn't there? Like it started off like he was young, and then all of a sudden it's when he's out doing his miracles and everything else. Like what happened in between? That was never.
There are some gospels that are, they're a trip, because there's a lot of gospels that didn't make it into the New Testament. So when they decided what's called the canon for the New Testament, they decided on 4. The reason for it can be kind of ambiguous, but the best that we've got is that at a certain point they said we need one for the north, the south, the east, and the west. I have no idea what the hell that means. But that being said, they chose 4 gospels, but there were over 40 that were written. Most of them are wild and crazy. They have all kinds of stuff. But to answer your question, though, one of them, or there's a couple that are considered the infancy gospels, and they talk about how Jesus was when he was a kid and when he was like a teenager and stuff like that. And they're a trip. You've got Jesus. He's and one of them, he's just making birds out of clay and just like throwing them up in the air, and he's just doing it because he's bored. And in another one, he's like playing in the mud, and another kid comes around and is just like starts like stomping all around, in the puddles and stuff like that. So Jesus, as a kid, he gets pissed and he makes the kid straight up fucking explode. Like he just murders this kid. It's ridiculous.
It doesn't fit the narrative of the righteousness.
Yeah, exactly. You mean this guy's going to say, "Blessed are the peacemakers," and he just like offed a kid? Like that doesn't make any sense. So there's it's a no-brainer to keep those out of the canon, to not present those as the best of the best. But ultimately, you are right. There's this huge gap there. In the canonical gospels as we have them, the last time that we hear from him as a kid is when he's 12, and he's taken to the temple, and he runs off. He gets lost, and his parents look for him. Well, he's talking to the high priest and just amazing them, according to the story. But then his parents show up, and they're like, "What the hell have you been doing? Like, you got us worried sick." And he's like, well, don't worry about it. I'm, doing what God wants me to." And they're like, "Okay, whatever," and just take him home. And like, that's it.
Yeah, there's an important reason that there is no childhood for Jesus. And that's because that first gospel we talked about from Marcion, he descends from the sky as an adult.
Yeah.
So if that's the first one, all this other stuff gets added later to make him more historical. But like we were saying, there was a whole Christian movement, and they believed in this celestial being. And that's where he came from. He came from the sky. in this
Mhm.
first gospel, and there was no childhood. He never was a human.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. The earliest versions of the Jesus story just had the guy coming down as an adult man out of heaven. Probably naked, but that's beside the point.
So the whole story of his birth and everything, that was all wrote way later.
Yes. Yes.
and that's actually one of the little pieces of evidence we're able to use to prove that Marcion's gospel was first.
Hmm.
In our stylometric analysis, one thing that we noticed was that the authorship for those birth narratives match the Acts of the Apostles, which is technically the second part of the Gospel of Luke in the canonical Bible.
Right.
But it didn't match the rest of the style of the main body of the text, where Marcion's Gospel started off, which means somebody took Marcion's Gospel and tried to make it theirs, but couldn't cover up their tracks in terms of style and other things. They actually get a story completely out of order.
Right.
Which is, if Jaren, you want to talk about that one,
Oh, yeah.
that was what really tipped us off that Marcion's Gospel
Yeah.
had to have come before at least Luke.
Oh, yeah. So in Marcion's Gospel, which is called Evangelion, and like we said, it was published in 144 CE. Jesus comes down as an adult into a town called Capernaum, which is in the region of Galilee there in Judea. So he comes down to Capernaum and he, does some miracles and whatnot, wows a whole bunch of people, just absolutely blowing their minds. And eventually some people are around him. They're all amazed. And he goes, well, this is Jesus. He says, I suppose that next you're going to ask me to do signs like I did back in Capernaum. And, he goes on to kind of dismiss these people. And that's fine. He came down to Capernaum, did some signs, and then started talking about how he had done signs before. But in the Gospel of Luke, they take that same verse. They take the verse that says, oh, do signs like you've done for us back in Capernaum. But the problem is, in the Gospel of Luke, he hasn't been to Capernaum yet. They took that part out. They took the part out where he came down as a adult into Capernaum, and they slapped on a birth story. And in doing so, they removed the part about him doing signs at Capernaum. So all of a sudden, that line is completely out of order. It doesn't make any sense. And Evangelion from Marcion is the only other gospel that has it other than Luke. So it's the smoking gun. Like he just took it. Like it's there in our English version of the Bible. He took it from Marcion.
Where did you guys go from that point? Like once you just come across that, you just kept diving into it further?
Yeah. So stylometry, I know that we've mentioned it a couple times. Basically, I have Matthew correct me because he does a lot more of the work on it. But in at least my words, what it is it's a peer-reviewed mathematical analysis. It's literary analysis. What it does is it tries to, using math and peer-reviewed formulas, it tries to assign authorship, or it tries to attribute authorship. So in other words, if I was to write something and you were to write something, and we run both of the texts, provided that they're the same language, we run both of these through stylometric analysis, it would be able to determine whether or not it was all from the same author, or if it was two separate authors. And then if another text gets introduced that could be yours, could be mine, it would be able to determine if it was yours or mine. It would go to either your text or it would be right next to my text. It just kind of spits out these results, and it puts them all on the same branch if they're on the, or if they're from the same author. So what we were able to do is dive into Luke, and sure enough, the birth story at the very beginning, and the story about him being really little and stuff like that in the temple and whatnot, that was all one author, along with the along with the ascension story at the end. That was all one author. But then everything in the middle came up as a different author. And that's because Marcion's gospel has that same content. So you have the Christians saying, oh, Marcion stole from Luke. And the followers of Marcion said, no, 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 Luke took from Marcion. So they're arguing back and forth. But if Marcion had taken from Luke, then when we ran Luke, it should have all came up as the same author, but it didn't. They
Right.
took from Marcion.
And in our book, we have the graphs, and this is all free open source software that anybody can run. We did all of this in the original Greek. All the New Testament was written in Greek. There are definitely manuscript problems in terms of we don't have any originals. The earliest copy of anything we have dates to around the year 200. But, to the best of what we have, we ran. Not only did we find this, we found that, we had said Mark was supposedly written in 70, and there's this prediction that, this temple's going to get destroyed and that's how they date it. Well, we ran it, and that chapter was not in the original version of Mark.
Right. Mark 13. Yeah.
Mark 13.
Comes up completely separate from the rest of Mark.
Which means that it was not there originally. So, which didn't make any sense because, if that was all one story written around the year 70, why would some other author have written that part? And so what we were able to piece together is that the original version of the Gospel of Mark was written around the year 120 or so, maybe 130. And then there was another destruction of Jerusalem in the year 135 called the Bar Kokhba Revolt. And that's what all this is about. That is what spurred Christianity onto what it became today. That's why in every version of what's called the Synoptic Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, you find a copy of this. They all copied each other, more or less. And Marcion moved to Rome in 135, 136, that time range, bringing with him that story, that prediction, and they're just using that as an analogy for the destruction of Judea. The temple represents Judea in that story. And Mark 13, the prediction of that, was added after the year 135, meaning all of our canonical gospels and all the gospels that anyone has found, Thomas, Peter, all these other gospels were after the year 135,
right?
Which kind of just, it blowed the, traditional dating out of the water. And then we started looking, into Paul and all these other things, and it just everything's kept showing up in the 2nd century.
Yeah. One of the big points there, that how we know that Mark 13, or where it starts talking about the destruction of the temple and stuff like that in the Gospels, the way that we know that that's related to 136, the Bar Kokhba revolt, as opposed to the destruction of Jerusalem there in 70, is that it has this line, and it's kind of weird, but it says, when you see the abomination of desolation standing where it shouldn't, let the reader understand. And that's a really weird line. It specifically says, let the reader understand. So it's basically telling the reader, think about what I'm saying here. And the abomination of desolation was a statue, specifically in the book of Daniel. And so in that particular story, it's this more or less like a idol, so to speak. But in 136, in the Bar Kokhba revolt, when Hadrian took over the area, when he finished off Bar Kokhba and all the rebels, he went to the Temple Mount and he installed a statue of himself where the Jewish temple used to be. And so that's them right there saying, hey, look, that's the abomination of desolation. That's the new one. That's the new abomination of desolation. And they're talking about it there in that little line. It's all like Matthew said, it's spurred on by Bar Kokhba. It has nothing. The Gospels have nothing to do with 70. It's everything to do with 136.
When you guys were able to figure all this out, I know there's going to be people listening, even ones that'll read your book or whatever. In like layman's terms, you mentioned like what you used or everything. How does it determine how it was written? Like who wrote it, different writers? How is it like an algorithm or like how does it function? Because I know people are gonna like, well, how can they can't prove that? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can.
So, oh yeah, yeah, yeah. We'll have Matthew talk to that. Yeah.
Yeah. So, like Jaren was saying, we used a form of stylometry, and the program is called Stylo, which is written in the programming language R. It's all available, peer-reviewed, free, open source. Anyone can download it. And what it does is there are a number of formulas you can use. We use a formula called Eater's delta, which is a distance formula. And you put all of your text you want to look at into a collection, and then the computer will analyze the frequency of the words in that collection. So, you think about the frequency of the words we use each day. It's not words that you would see in like, theological things. It's not talking about, crucifixion or temple or things like that. We use words like it, I, the, a, and same goes for Greek. They've got their own version of these function words. And it turns out that these function words are basically a linguistic fingerprint for everybody who talks and everybody who writes. And this software, this type of analysis has actually been able to prove modern day authorship of something as small as a tweet. So the example we use in the book, we use two examples. One is two different researchers actually were able to determine when former President Trump wrote a tweet or if he had one of his interns do it based on stylometric analysis. So they would just look at the tweets and be able to tell based off of, running it through these kinds of formulas and tell, who wrote it. Same goes with J.K. Rowling. So she has a pen name, Robert Galbraith. And for a long time, people didn't know who that was. And somebody ran a program very similar to the one we ran and was able to correctly identify that she was the author behind Robert Galbraith. And eventually it forced the publisher to admit, yes, she was, who wrote that book. And so when we did this, we created a test corpus, which is like a test body of texts, and we got it up to 96% accuracy in Greek for that time range Jaren was talking about. It's about 400-year range. And the way we tested it, we have letters and all kinds of documents from people all over the Roman Empire that spoke Greek. You collect things that were written by the same person. And when it correctly attributes them, it'll put them all in this group and say, this is all one author. Then it's working. Because a lot of these people, like say Clement of Alexandria or Origen, these Christians writing in like around the year 200 or so, we were able to use them for an example out of many as part of our tests. And we saw that, okay, it's the way we're doing this is getting it 96+% of the time right. And then we went back in and we tested it on the New Testament. And with what we're using, we're actually able to look at it at a chapter by chapter level. And that's how we were able to look at that text with Luke and Marcion and see that chapters 1 through 3 of Luke were not in the original version. And part of chapter 4 and part of chapter 24, the final chapter, were not in the original version of the Jesus story. So it's something that, we didn't come up with ourselves, and that was a concern of ours, is we didn't want to have some black box formula if we did record or did do this all ourselves and program it ourselves. So we really, honestly, we're just at a lucky time in this period of history where this software came out in either 2015 or 2017. A bunch of Greek texts just became available online in the past 5 or 10 years too. And we're just now getting to where we can reconstruct Marcion's gospel, because go figure, what became the Catholic Church destroyed all the copies of Marcion's gospel, along with all kinds of other, what would be invaluable texts if we can look at them.
There's a bunch that the Catholic Church tends to keep from people, I feel like.
Oh yeah. Yeah, and hey, we came out with this book thinking, it's possible that, all of a sudden the Catholic Church might hit us with some giant hurdle. They may come up and say, "Hey, look, we got this thing down in the Vatican somewhere in some library that just completely destroys all your work." And hey, look, hey, if we're wrong, we're wrong. That's why in our book we tell people exactly what software we're using, how to get it, how to run it. And we say, hey, look, go prove us wrong. If we're wrong, we're wrong, and we'll admit it. But you can probably run it and exactly see exactly how
you guys came up to your conclusions.
Yeah. That's the idea.
I've got some questions, but I don't want to keep derailing. So.
No worries. Yeah. Well, as Matthew stated, there is what's called a reconstruction of Marcion that we were able to run. And it's really, really cool. So as he stated, what eventually became the Catholic Church, the Christians deemed Marcion as a heretic, and all of his followers, the Marcionites, they were considered heretics too. So they wanted nothing to do with them. They destroyed a lot of those gospels and everything like that. But we're able to reconstruct it because they talked so much shit. If it wasn't for them talking shit, we wouldn't have the ability to reconstruct it. So early church fathers actually at certain points literally went line by line and talked crap about all these different quotes, all these different verses from Marcion, and said, oh, well, he says this, and we think it's wrong because of this, and he says this, and he says this, and we have so many quotes that we're able to actually take that and reconstruct his gospel. We didn't do it. Scholars did it. Our favorite in specific is a text from Jason Badoon, who's a scholar who was able to put together Marcion's gospel. He was able to piece it back together. And I mean, this is all, like Matthew said, it's stuff that is, it's within the last 10, 11 years. I think Jason Badoon's, correct me if I'm wrong, Matthew, but I think his reconstruction came out in 2013, I believe.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah. So that's the one thing that is really something to remember here, and for you, for anyone listening to this, it's the idea that, if you're thinking, wait a minute, all these scholars and stuff like that have been saying for years that Jesus did this and Paul did this, and we have historical blah, 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 blah. No, we don't. That was the old idea. Those were the old ideas based on old information. What we're talking about here, these reconstructions of Marcion, and in fact, the reconstruction of Marcion that we just talked about in 2013, that was the English one. We didn't actually have the Greek in specific until like a few years ago, at most. So ultimately, the information that we're able to use here and run through this analysis and present in our book, like Matthew said, it is really recent. And so we're on the forefront of what will more or less be a wave of mythicism that comes in here. And not to toot our own horn here, but ultimately that's what we're seeing. You look at scholars today, and they are absolutely starting to say there's some reasons to doubt this Jesus character. There really is.
Right. And mythicism being the belief that Jesus was a mythical figure.
Yes.
And
Yes.
and that's something, it's not acceptable in a lot of circles to even question. You take a figure like, Zeus or Hercules, and it's a legitimate question to ask, did this start out as a mythical story, like folklore, or is there some historical truth behind it? Was it Hercules or Zeus or Jesus? Were they myths first that then became historicized, or were they actual historical people who became mythicized or turned into gods? And so mythicist is the term for people who think that Jesus started out as a myth or folklore or a deity, as opposed to starting out as a historical figure who then got called Christ or God.
Yeah. And consider what Matthew was talking about with the Gospel of Luke and what we already said there, where they took from Marcion, which said he came down from heaven as an adult, and they put a birth story. That's because they're more or less trying to historicize him. Matthew comes first as a response to Evangeline, and it has a kind of a birth. It has a birth story, but it's not as ornate. It's not as detailed as Luke's, which comes later. But that's the idea. Slowly but surely, you can see how they're coming up with the more historical Jesus. Mark, Evangeline, no birth story. All of a sudden, Matthew, they got a birth story, and they've got a bit of a fairly primitive genealogy. Luke goes a little bit more into the genealogy and everything like that. It tries to not only have a birth story, but it tries to place it in a certain time. It's like, oh, hey, well, Quirinius was here and Herod was here. And you look at the dates that it gives and the names that it gives, and they don't even line up. It's clearly just somebody guessing. It's not actually historically reliable. But at the same time, they're attempting to make him fit into history somewhere. That's the idea.
Do you think that the reasoning behind all of this is like what's the purpose? I guess I don't want to. I was going to ask this later, but
right.
What is the purpose of Jesus? Like, what was the whole end game? If they wrote stories about a character that didn't exist, like, what was their end game? If they already had the Old Testament, what was the point of why they wanted to write this new one about? I'm going to reference like comic books, but like the superhero.
Yeah, well, I will say that there are some mythicists out there who do have some wilder takes, some that don't really have any evidence to support it or anything like that. The more recent one that we have kind of seen floating around is the idea that the Romans started it, and that the Roman government was trying to come up with a more pacifist religion, and was trying to put down the Jews in specific who were being rebellious in these wars, these revolts, and they were saying, hey, look at Jesus, he says pay your taxes, and ultimately the Romans, we put him on the cross and everything because we're in charge, ha ha ha, and so there are some ideas that are floating around regarding more or less like a conspiracy from the Roman government. There's just no evidence for that, and ultimately a lot of these books come after the Bar Kokhba revolt, and the Bar Kokhba revolt would have been the last time that there was really anything there between the Jews and the Romans. After the Bar Kokhba revolt, they renamed Judea Roman Palestina because they just pretty much just wiped them all out and everything, and the Jews were spread out there in the outlying areas and provinces. So there's not really a lot of evidence to suggest that it was like a conspiracy per se. Not really at all. By the time it was written, but at the same time, there are plenty of evidences for mystery cults. These little beliefs, or these little religions that just kind of behaved in really strange ways. One of the earliest attestation to Christians is Pliny the Younger, and he is at the time in 111 CE, he was the governor of, as Matthew pointed out earlier, that area that Marcion comes from, which was Bithynia and Pontus. And he comes in contact with these Christians, and he's writing a letter to the Emperor Trajan. And he's like, I don't know who the hell these people are. I don't know what they believe. I have no idea. So I started torturing them to try to figure out what they believed. So he starts torturing them, and he's saying all this stuff about what they do. He says they share everything, including money and food, and they help each other out. They get together, and they meet together and sing songs or hymns or whatever, and they believe in Christ, but he never says Jesus. Never once does he say Jesus. He doesn't mention any texts that they have, when, according to Christian tradition, all of the books should have been available by this point. But 111, nothing, no text, no name Jesus, no he was crucified by Pilate, nothing. They're Christians. They believe in a Christ, but they don't have a Jesus story yet. But ultimately, the way he describes them is incredibly similar to mystery cults that we have from the first century, or even dating before. There's a group down near Alexandria called the Therapeutai, and the Therapeutai are written about in Philo. Now, Philo was a historian who was in the first half of the first century, and he doesn't say jack shit about Jesus, but yet he talks about this group called the Therapeutai, which is like this offshoot of Judaism, that they all lived in this commune by a lake down in Alexandria. And they got together once a week, shared food, sang hymns, read from the scriptures, like the Old Testament. And after that, they dispersed and went back to their communes and lived peacefully. And it was extremely similar. It's so close to Christianity that later church leaders, church fathers in the 2nd century tried to claim the Therapeutai as the earliest Christian monks. And they weren't, but they tried to claim them as that because they saw the similarities. It's pointed out a lot.
Yeah, and we think, or at least we speculate in the book towards the end when we ask ourselves that question, like how did it go from this, just a belief in this spiritual savior based on, whatever it might have been based on their personal experiences or what traditions they had at the time, into there was a historical guy, X number of years ago, 100 years ago. And what we think happened is when the first version of the Gospel of Mark came out, which was around 120, we're trying to reconstruct it right now. That's our next project. And it's so trimmed down from what you see in the modern version of Mark that we have available to us. We think what happened is somebody's just writing some kind of story or play. The language they use is very, I guess, unsophisticated. Every sentence starts with "and," pretty much.
Every sentence.
I mean, yeah, just
about, yeah.
Every single, yeah. And it looks like what happened is once Marcion brought his gospel, which was, he had this copy, this proto-Mark. And it's important to note that we're saying Marcion because that's how you say it in English, but in the languages they would speak at the time, it would have been Markion. And then,
which means little Mark.
Little Mark. And Mark is, the shortest gospel. And he brings it to Rome. And then we think he probably collaborated with another group there to create his gospel, Evangelion. And that what happened is after some people saw Evangelion, there's this figure walking around in this story. And yeah, he descended from the sky. But it made sense to people that he was historical, and this idea of a historical figure doing this stuff caught on. And when you get to the Gospel of Matthew, it just is historical for them. They interpret everything as literal and historical. And my favorite example in the Gospel of Matthew of that author taking things literally is he's citing basically a poem from the Old Testament in Hebrew. And it says, they will ride a donkey and a foal or something to that effect, the child of a donkey. And it's a way of writing in Hebrew that you duplicate things, but it doesn't mean it's actually two. They're talking about one. And it's just, the style that Matthew doesn't get that though. And so he has Jesus ride into Jerusalem on 2 donkeys at the same time. And so that's just what happened is they took this story literally, and then people really latched on to this literal story and lost that concept of this was all a spiritual movement, and it became this historical, effectively, movement that had to be absolutely true because it was history. Yeah. And then it was tied in with all those theological beliefs, and you end up with, it becomes the religion of the Roman Empire, and Emperor Constantine writes this edict that all Marcionite churches have to be destroyed in the 300s. And from then on, you don't hear any more about the Marcionites, and you don't hear a lot about Christians who, up until that point, might have still believed that this wasn't a historical story. It was just, a spiritual one.
Yeah, the Marcionites continued on with that belief that Jesus wasn't really historical. or at the very least, if he had a body, he wasn't fully God. It was a very different version of Christianity that wasn't holding to as much as the literal interpretations of the others were. But I mean, they lasted until all of a sudden Constantine said, do away with them, kill them, get rid of them. As luck would have it, the oldest inscription that we have, like oldest physical inscription that we have of Jesus, is a stone that appears to be from an archway, above a doorway there. And it's from a church of Marcion, like a Marcionite church. And it mentions Jesus. And we know that it's a Marcionite church because of the language that they use there. And so, it's kind of funny that in a sense, kind of Marcion kind of got the last laugh there, that like the oldest inscription that we have is from his church, not anybody else's.
There's been several different religions or deities or whatever you want to call them that have the same story as Jesus too, which I've always thought was interesting. Because I'm pretty sure, like, you had wasn't the Egyptian one Osiris? Wasn't he supposed to be like their son of a god or whatever? And he kind of died on, like, similar things. I've been attributed to the same stories, and I could be 100% wrong on this, but in the Old Testament, there was never mention of Satan, was there?
In the Old Testament, Satan shows up. Yeah, Satan's definitely in the Old Testament. It's just that, so the concept of Satan wasn't always there for the ancient Jews. The ancient Jews,
yeah.
Go ahead.
Satan shows up, but not the devil, I think is the best way to put it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because that's what I was kind of thinking is, like, with the New Testament, I've said this years ago before anything like this. I always thought it was strange, like, you don't really hear much about the devil or whatever in the Old Testament, but they made the New Testament, whoever wrote it, you had your protagonist, which would be Jesus.
Yeah.
And so you had to have an antagonist. So who they made the devil, Lucifer, Satan, whatever you want to call him. Like, you had your good guy and your bad guy. And then the New Testament's God is completely almost different seeming from the Old Testament God. The Old Testament God is this almost like a jealous God.
Right.
If you say it that way. And the new one, like, oh, he sends his son here. He wants to bless us and forget. The old one's like, no, I'm going to wipe y'all out.
Well, there's a massive reason for that. Marcion's theology was that Jesus was sent by a God called God the Father, who was different from Yahweh, and that Jesus was sent to more or less ransom or purchase the souls of humanity from this other God, to basically save us from Yahweh. That was Marcion's idea. And so that, it makes sense that you would notice that, because it's definitely there. It's definitely there. And that's why Marcion was deemed a heretic, because he believed in more or less another God.
Yeah. That was one of the Ten Commandments, wasn't worship no other gods.
And despite the fact that, if there's only one God, then why would you even need to say that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. I've always thought that too, is like, when it comes to religion, this is why I'm not religious. So I feel like, of all the tragedies that happen, all the things that we have to go through, everything that people go through, seeing children have cancers or whatever.
Right.
Why do we have to have all the suffering? If they sent a supposed Jesus back to save us, all this and that, it came back at a time frame where no one really knew much of anything, to an extent, like, not to how we are now. Like, there was no, it's weird to me that the way life has evolved, the way we've evolved and become with technology and everything else, you keep hearing the story of Jesus is coming back. Like, that's the big Christian thing. At what point is he coming back? Like, how far off does life have to go before this Jesus is coming back to save us all? When's the rapture coming? You know what I mean? Like,
right.
None of it ever made sense to me.
Yeah. And you got to wonder, of course, this is kind of putting more supernatural concepts back into it. But ultimately, if God is sending his son, why did he send it? Or why did he send him to to the Middle East back in, back 2,000 years ago.
Mhm.
Like, if you're going to send them back then, send them to China. They keep a lot of written records over there. The literacy rate is pretty good compared to 3 to 5% literacy rate over there in Judea. And if you're going to send them to that area, just send them modern day when they have cameras, when they have video, something like that. And on top of that, even if you were to say, okay, there's some kind of weird reason why they went to Judea, and there's some kind of weird reason why you picked that particular time. Okay, great. Why did you not offer us anything that was going to be valuable? Why did you not tell us about how, the Romans at the time, they thought that diseases were spread by bad smells, not germs, bad smells. Teach us about germs, Jesus. Teach us the ingredients for penicillin. Like, you know what I mean? Like, teach us something that's going to be useful.
Well, that's the one thing it's not useful for me because I'm allergic to it.
Oh, okay. Well, there's that.
Yeah.
But he's just regurgitating a lot of these older concepts. If you ask, just anyone off the street, hey, who came first, Jesus or Socrates? They'll probably say Jesus, because just kind of the way that, especially in America, I guess, the way that we kind of are raised to kind of assume this like religious just confirmation, like in the sense that you place the Bible, you place Bible times, you place it into history in your mind, and it's almost more of an anchor than anything else. And again, I when I've asked people, adults, teenagers, people my age, whatever, hey, who came first, Plato or Jesus? They say, I think Jesus came first, right? And I'm like, no, Plato, he predated him like by a couple hundred years. You know what I mean? Like, it's just, people assume that Jesus is somehow delivering these messages first, when in reality, very little of it is new at all. There's a lot of things that were taken from the concept of the teacher of righteousness, which was a Jewish leader in specific that had a lot of teachings and everything like that from BCE, and just kind of got lifted. There are some things that just get lifted from previous writers. But you had talked a little bit about the concept of when Jesus is coming back and all that kind of stuff, and that kind of ties in a little bit with Revelation. And we found some pretty, I guess, neat to us, pretty cool to us, kind of stuff about Revelation. I'll let Matthew kind of share with you what we found.
Yeah. So, the standard view on Revelation is that it was written by John in his, I guess, 90s or so, or it was written in the 90s, and he was an old man at the time. After, I think, he had been boiled in oil is the story, something like that, and then exiled to Patmos.
Just have a terrible life,
Right.
just
Yeah.
terrible time.
And what we found when we ran it is that the first 3 chapters, which are just kind of the intro and then some letters to churches, all in modern day Turkey, which is where we've discovered the religion actually started. It didn't start in Judea. The rest of the text after that was actually originally a Jewish text written in Hebrew. And the way we can tell is because when you translate a text, a lot of the wordings and word choices carry over, so that most frequent words in that document, they show up like the Greek version of the Hebrew Bible. And what's interesting about that is it opens up the possibility for the dates having actually been further back. Because people like to date it and say it was in the 90s because it's talking about this emperor, or it was in the 60s because it's talking about this emperor. We don't really know now, but the point being, it was a stolen document. It was just lifted from, whatever Jewish author wrote it, and Christians kind of made it their own. And we see a lot of that, like you had said, a lot of, stuff is not original, whether it's like the concept of a dying, rising God, or the moral teachings that Jesus has that are found in, all different kinds of philosophies and religion at the time.
If Asclepius heals people, Orion walks on water.
Right. Yeah, actually, one of the healing stories Jesus does, he spits in somebody's eyes. And that sounds really weird, but that was actually a thing from another cult at the time
Serapis.
Serapis, where like for some reason spit had healing power, and so that's what they did. And when we were working out, like you were saying, like a devil concept is not really in the Old Testament the way it is in the New Testament. So we're trying to figure out like how did this whole worldview come around that the Christians had at that time. And we're working on that in our current one with the proto-mark work. And if you look into different languages and cultures all across Europe and even into Iran and India, there was an underlying it's called the Proto-Indo-European language, and they had a god broadly across those various cultures called Deus or Deus Pater, which is like sky god or godfather. And Zeus, the name Zeus comes from that. The name Jupiter, it's literally a variation of Deus Pater, Jupiter. Um, but he didn't create the world. He was a father, but he didn't create the world. And then Judaism is from a Semitic language, Hebrew, and they have a creator God who doesn't necessarily really have a son, depending on how you read it and stuff. So what we think happened is these merged, and they took some from Judaism, they took that creator God, and they decided, well, the creator God's really mean in the Old Testament, so we need another God. And they've got this one from, the Indo-European cultures, like, Greek, and that's where God the Father came from. And then he sends down the Son to more or less ransom the souls of humanity from the mean God Yahweh.
Another kind of, I guess, name or kind of variant, so to speak, of Jupiter is Jovis, Joves. And what's interesting is that, and I'm going to use the English letters here. I know that technically, there's Greek and, some Latin involved at a certain point and everything in order to get there. But the Gospels, the New Testament, they use something called the nomina sacra, and no one really knows why. No one really has a good answer why. And what that is they would abbreviate words. They would abbreviate these names. Like, for instance, Jesus would, and I'm using the English variant of these letters, but Jesus would be JS. That's it. And they didn't actually spell out Jesus for a really long time. But in the text, Jesus was JS. That's more or less what he would be called. And it's interesting because that could be really anything that in English has J at the beginning and S at the end. So it could be Jovis or it could be Jesus. It's very possible that the earliest writers were more or less combining, like Matthew said, these concepts from the son of the sky father, the godfather, Jupiter, and combining it with Judaism.
The thesis for like Jesus would be the Romans needed something, which I think is strange too. But like the Catholic Church is based in Rome. Rome are the ones that supposedly crucified Christ. You mentioned earlier they kind of needed something to not so much persuade the Jews, but like a different type of religion. It's almost like everything was made just to change like the narrative. Like I said before, and I've always, it's like a means to control.
I mean, to some extent, you look at the early church leaders and you see that, they're writing some of this stuff. They're making up a lot of the religion as you go. As far as control, I mean, maybe, sure, to keep power, positions of power. Again, there's no evidence to suggest that the Roman government is behind it. But I mean, obviously somebody is coming up with these stories and everything. And we just think that they're, just people, human beings who are just saying, hey, let me keep this thing going. Let me keep my position of power. There's this guy who wrote, and some Christians will actually try to claim him as proof of Jesus, but he's not. He's so late, it doesn't matter. but his name's Lucian, Lucian of Samosata. He was a satirist. He wrote a lot of. It's pretty funny if you take time to read him, but he wrote a lot of little stories, little books, and in one of his books, he writes about this guy named Peregrinus Proteus, and Proteus comes from well, he comes from Asia Minor. He comes from modern day Turkey, where all of this is. And somehow he gets involved in a pretty early in life. As a young man, he gets involved with the Christians, and he convinces them, according to Lucian, he had convinced them that he was really, really smart. And they heralded him as the second coming of Socrates. They loved him. They gave him food, they gave him shelter, they gave him tons of money, and he was just a con man. Proteus, he just ate it all up. He loved it. They promoted him to bishop and stuff like that. Lucian said that he not only wrote books, but he edited other books and sent letters to a whole bunch of different cities, which, by the way, sounds a lot like Paul. Sounds a lot like, all these different people that are writing these letters. Sounds a lot like another guy named Ignatius. He was writing letters to different cities and stuff like that. It sounds a lot like him. But anyways, Proteus, eventually he ends up eating something that the Christians thought was unclean or something, and so they kick him out of the church. I mean, really finicky type people. But ultimately, the entire point that Lucian was trying to make was that the Christians were so gullible that they just threw all their money at this guy. And so the takeaway here is that you have these people who are bishops in this religion, more or less creating this religion, making it up as they go along. But there is an incentive to keep doing it. There's an incentive to keep going. And, lots of times people say, oh, well, why would the Christians lie if they were getting killed? And it's like, well, there's actually very, very little evidence that they ever really did. Like I said earlier, when Pliny wrote that letter to Trajan and he was explaining that he was torturing the Christians to try to figure out what they believed, Trajan said, hey, cut that out. Don't worry about it. Unless they're like Christians and they refuse to take part in anything, in as far as the Roman Empire goes, don't mess with them. That kind of thing. So ultimately, there's not a lot of evidence that these guys were killed. In fact, there's more evidence that they were thrown bukus of money and had great positions of power and influence over all these people. So it doesn't have to come from the government. It just has to come from these preachers.
Right. And, we see in one of the letters that's used very frequently in terms of, controlling a lot of what goes on in the church, multiple letters. It's 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus. And these are some of the latest letters. And in there, we're actually able to tell that not even we prove it with our stylometric analysis, but even without that, in the text, we're able to identify that it is really late because the author is just so, I guess, self-absorbed that he gives away who is writing this letter, and it's not Paul who the letter says, this is from
Right.
Paul. It's
Right.
actually from someone named Polycarp and his scribe Crescens. And you see this name Carpus, which is the short version of what Polycarp's name would have been, Polycarpus, and then his scribe Crescens, which is in the actual letter from Polycarp that we still have.
Yeah.
And, these letters are used to fight back against other religious groups. It's the one, I think, that tells women to keep their head covered. It more or less maintains the slave system in there.
There's a
things
lot
like
of
that.
fighting, a lot of infighting.
A lot of infighting going on. And then by the time, you get to Constantine, he has the church wipe out, or not just church, the Roman Empire wipe out the Marcionites, the opposing groups. And even up until like the 1200s, the Catholic Church is putting out official decrees saying no one is allowed to read the Bible unless you are a priest. No one's allowed to translate it. Even if they can read, They are not allowed to translate it, not allowed to read it. No one is able to access it except the clergy. Because when you actually read it, and if you read it close enough and with this, skeptical mindset about it, you start seeing names like, Polycarp and things like that. And it's a trend throughout the history of the religion and a lot of religions.
Yeah, I mean, they're clinging on to power, and they can get away with it. I mean, it's pretty well documented, believe it or not. As soon as the Christians came to power in the 300s, they wasted no time destroying temples, destroying statues, destroying artwork, claiming that, other people were satanic and stuff like that. There's a church father in the 2nd century that said that Satan had gone around the world before Jesus even showed up and taught people how to take the Lord's Supper, like drink wine as blood and eat bread as flesh, because that was a thing that was already around. There were already cults that were doing that before Jesus showed up. They just stole the idea and then just claimed it was satanic before Jesus shows up, which doesn't even make any sense. But, that being said, they did all kinds of stuff. I mean, look up, the listeners, anybody they can look up Hypatia. Hypatia, she was a Greek astronomer who was drugged through the city into a temple called the Caesarion and murdered by the Christians in the 300s because they claimed that she was just a witch. Like, she had, as soon as they came to power, they were just mad with it. It was their turn to be the boot, and they went to town stomping.
Here we are almost 2,000 years later, and it still seems to be that way.
Oh yeah.
I do have something, again, like I mentioned, I wanted to talk about.
Yeah.
And this is going to go on the woo-woo side, that supernatural element. But many people that I've talked to at this show, they tend to think and say that when they have weird experiences, obviously like something paranormal, and I've had my own weird stuff happen too. If they claim they use the name of Jesus Christ, it makes these entities, these spirits, these whatever that could possibly be, even people who have claimed they've been abducted by aliens, claim they've rebuked the aliens with Jesus Christ, and that leaves them alone. Why would a name have so much power if the thing didn't exist? Like, that's where I've always come back to, like, when people say, oh, you just need to pray to Jesus, this and that. I'm like, why would that even work? Because I'm not a religious person. Right. So it's like, if I'm praying, I'm going through here and saying this in the name of Jesus Christ, whatever. Oh, it's going to listen to me, even if I don't believe. Like, how does that work?
Matthew, if you wanted to take that, I know that you had talked a little bit about that particular book of, I think it was Book of Spells or something that was written or something.
Yeah, that was actually what I was thinking of. I don't remember exactly when it was written. It was somewhere between like the years 200, 300, I think. But there is a collection of spells from, I think it's in Egypt, and it's just a collection of spells from around the Roman Empire. Somebody went around the empire and collected what they believed were powerful sayings. And I say spells, but it was just kind of variations. It might be spells
and stuff.
It might be mantras. It's just variations of, spoken words that they thought had power. And one of them is actually Jesus. And it's not Christ, it's Crest, which is really interesting because that means like the good, which is what a lot of Marcionites called him. It wasn't Jesus, the Messiah or anointed one. It was Jesus, the good or the righteous one. And this wasn't even necessarily a Christian book. They just, but it was collected in with all these others. Like we were saying earlier, this book that we wrote, Christ Before Jesus, is about the historical aspects of it. We really don't delve into the religious aspects. Obviously, there was some belief that started a Christ movement. We just think that the historical figure that it became, like the guy with the beard and long hair and the white robes, whether it's that or like a more like historical, so to speak, idea of him, that just came later and is what was made up. We don't really speak to anybody's experiences or their beliefs before. We try to guess, and try to work out what we can based off of what texts we do have. But it's beyond the purview of this specific book. We are working on, like we said, that Proto Mark one to try to get a better idea of where this all came from. Yeah, Jaren, if you wanted to
Right.
give your
Yeah.
input.
But I would, however, just to try to attempt to, answer the book at all, that, it seems to have been something that people thought worked or felt worked or whatever, going back, you know, 1800 years, I got the, more or less the Marcionites or someone vaguely familiar with them that seem to be using some kind of mantra with that name, thinking that it would be beneficial, against, bad spirits or anything like that. So, I mean, it seems to date back really, really far. But again, obviously, if he doesn't exist, he doesn't exist. And so, people can deal with that however they want to deal with it. But I mean, ultimately, yeah, we do kind of see something kind of trace back.
I think the concept of Jesus was something that works for people. And if they want to believe in it, and if that helps them be a good person and sleep better at night, I'm all for that.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
that's faith, basically. Like if you have faith in something and you live a good life, that's what I said earlier. I'm not a religious person, but I think if you're a good person, that's what I think most of this stuff was always about, is they're trying to set like almost like guidelines. And for whatever reason, they made a mythological main character
Right.
to set out these guidelines.
Yeah. I mean, there was obviously some kind of intent initially, whether that be, to try to, poke fun or to, dismiss a lot of the Jewish beliefs. Because I mean, if you're writing post 136 and the Jews have just come out in droves from Judea, and because of the Bar Kokhba revolt and everything like that, and they're now in your country. I mean, maybe there could be some animosity there, which led to the creation of the first gospel proto Mark. There's we don't know the intent. We don't know if it's that. We don't know if it's someone who just really, really, really likes the Jews and wants to kind of write something with that backdrop. We don't know if it's somebody who just picked up the book of Josephus, some of his books, and thought, okay, let me write a story that's kind of based on. We don't know. It seems to be a play. It seems to be, some kind of, like you said, a mythological kind of story at first that just kind of took off, but we don't know the intent. And I mean, ultimately, if somebody did truly sort of kind of hope that there was some savior, and that was their fictional story of this savior that they were wanting, sure, great. I don't know what the intent was. I don't know if it was to establish rules or not, but eventually, there was it spread with a whole bunch of downtrodden people, people who were uneducated and people who were, disenfranchised. So, I mean, you do kind of find that kind of like that faith element of it, that seems to keep people happy. Which again, I don't want to necessarily step on anybody's happiness or anything. I just care about personally just the truth, and putting that out there. And so, yeah, I mean, if somebody wants to believe in a Jesus that, yeah, I mean, that's fine. But I guess my only recommendation there would be to, hey, recognize that this is mythical, that, you can believe in Hercules, you can pray to Hercules. I don't give a shit, just ultimately just come on, like, don't hold on to this dogmatic belief system, this book that was written years and years ago and is demonstrably false, and somehow use what's in it to dictate how you treat other people and how you think about other people, and ultimately how you vote. I mean, if you have a belief in something, you have a belief in something, and if it's based in truth, it's based in truth, and that's awesome. But you got to be careful when you back up your beliefs with something that isn't real. As Voltaire said, when we believe absurdities, we commit atrocities. We don't exist in a vacuum, and eventually your beliefs will come out. So be very careful as to what we put into our brains.
No, I agree with that. There's a lot of faith being put into a lot of things, and I think when nowadays people's religion and faith is what is being manipulated into other avenues of life. I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole in this episode,
Right,
but
right.
it there's a lot of things when it comes to religion that I feel like is being used as means now more nefariously than what
Yeah,
it
I
was
would agree.
originally
I would
intended
definitely
for.
agree. And I think Matthew would probably agree on that too.
Yeah, yeah. And that was kind of almost the message of the whole thing is that like it's just not what it originally started out as, not as what it was intended for better or worse.
Religion now, especially Christianity, is a very big profitable thing to be involved in. And I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I mean, I think, as time goes on, I think that we're going to see, like I mentioned earlier, I think I mentioned earlier, I don't know, that, I think we're going to see, yeah, that scholarship is going to start kind of more or less trending towards the mythicism standpoint, the idea that Jesus didn't exist, that a lot of these characters from the New Testament were probably made up for a particular purpose, to advance the particular religion, and made up over time, historicized over time, that kind of thing. And so I do see that things will probably move that direction, and eager to see what that looks like and how that unfolds into daily life and society as we know it. Obviously it's got to trickle down. It starts with the scholars, and then finally it gets maybe talked about in a college course, and then eventually it goes to maybe K through 12 eventually. You know what I mean, like over time that kind of concept just kind of trickles through education, trickles through our understanding of the world and everything. I mean, already we're starting to see a lower amount here in America of people who like go to church, or people who consider themselves religious. You know, it's there's a movement in specific that is seeming to really take place.
And then when you listen to the diehards that are still religious,
Yeah.
they people that don't go to church and removing God from this, like you can't say in God we trust, or prayers in school and everything else, depending on what part of the country you're in. I'm in a very deep red state, so
Right.
everything here is super religious, and if you go down that route to where you're trying to remove things, people are getting upset around here just because you're trying to uproot everything they've been taught, and it's very
Yeah.
hard for anyone to accept anything new.
Right. And I mean, hey, I mean that's what life is all about, in my opinion, is growing as a human being. And a lot of that is, taking new information and processing it and thinking, hey, do I need to change who I am? Do I need to change what I believe? Do I need to tweak it? Or is, it's possible that what you hear might be complete and total BS. And if that's the case, well, that's the case. But I think the best way to determine if it is to make sure that you live your life believing as many true things as possible and not believing as many false things as possible, and possibly, being able to use that as a barrier, or that as a barometer for how you want to determine if something is, a good new idea or not.
You know, anyone that's listened to the show should know by now that I remain skeptical on a lot of things, and I've always encouraged everyone to keep a healthy dose of skepticism when it comes to any topics that people bring on here, not to discredit any guest or anything like that, but
Yeah.
it's I believe in what I believe. I know what I can see and what science proves, but at the same time, science doesn't prove everything. And I've seen some stuff that science shouldn't even say is it like there's no proof of it. So it's
Mm.
like I know what I saw, so I'm not going to discredit anyone else for like the weird things that they see too. But when it comes to like religious aspects, I wasn't there 2,000 years ago. So if someone wants to have faith, like I've said, if religion works for people, that's great. But I've just always, it's not been my thing.
Right. And like we said, this isn't an atheist book or anything. Christ Before Jesus is it's a book that just presents what we found. I mean, one could literally read the entire book, believe everything that we say, and still have belief in God. I mean, yeah. In fact, you could even be a Christian. You could just accept that, Christian just kind of means something a little bit less historical now, maybe as a mystery cult or something. But yeah, you could 100%. We debated whether or not, I think Matthew was thinking about whether or not we put that into the to the end of the book. Something about how Christianity, if maybe it had accepted, or maybe if it today accepted, it's more of its roots, maybe it would look different. I don't know.
Yeah, because like we were saying, those a lot of the fake letters are where you find these things like, the women need to be silent and stuff like that. Those were like all of it, yeah, was written way after the fact, but those tend to be the latest ones and the ones that are being written by these bishops and such that have some interest in protecting their power. So the original religion, it had that kind of like the mysterious aspect, the spiritual savior, things like that. And there still are some moral teachings behind it, but it didn't have all of that, the baggage that it developed over the next 100+ years.
Yeah, that's kind of where I've said, not like it was used once it was got out there for the people in power to want to stay in power, like to control their narrative. They wanted to feed it on the people, so everyone had to believe what they wanted them to believe in, so they could keep on being in charge for the church and whatever else they wanted to do. I think they influenced a lot of how life has become the way it is now. But that's my tinfoil hat thought for the night.
Nice.
No, if you guys would like to let everyone know where they can find your book, we're getting about to get close to over an hour and a half, so we can kind of wrap this one up.
Oh yeah, yeah. So again, our book comes out specifically on March 16th. That is 3/16. We did that on purpose, and it comes out on Amazon on print. We're finishing up an audiobook. Hopefully, it'll be around that same time, and also ebook copy. And as far as ebook goes, look, we're not trying to get rich off of this kind of stuff. We're putting the ebook at $2.99. So right when it comes out, we're going to have it at $2.99, and yeah, I mean, it again, we're not going to get rich off of it. We're just trying to get the idea out there, because the way that scholarship kind of looks at this, is they want to see certain credentials before they really start taking a look from a peer review kind of standpoint. If we submitted this to scholars, they'd say, oh, did you go to a seminary, or do you have a PhD in Greek, or all these different things that we just simply don't have. So ultimately, we did notice that a lot of mythicist authors would get mentioned by scholars, and they would feel obligated to respond to these authors if the authors were, if they sold enough books. If they sold enough books, if they got popular enough, then yeah, a lot of these scholars would have to respond. So more or less, that is our only way. That's our only way of actually getting in front of these guys. So ultimately, yeah, we're not trying to get rich. We're just trying to get the idea out there, and maybe have a lot of scholarship take another look at the Bible, take another look at the New Testament.
Yeah, and we also do lives on TikTok, just so people, like, if you hear this and anybody wants to ask us questions directly, we try to be accessible, just like that software we use, open source, free, everybody can do it. we welcome all different people to come in, ask questions if they get it or not, the book or not. We're on every week. So
I will include a link in the show notes to the book because by the time this airs, which will probably be, I think, the first or second week of April, your book should already be out for about a week or two.
Right.
So I'll have the link in the show notes for anyone that's interested. And if you want to send me the link to your TikTok, I can put that on there as well.
Definitely. Well, thank you, sir.
Yep, not a problem. I appreciate you guys coming on here and talking with me tonight. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, absolutely.
Been very informative and a little eye-opening here and there.
Well,
Yeah,
thanks. And hopefully we didn't put too many people to sleep, but hey,
no,
throw it on if you need a good night's sleep.
Or too many pitchforks.
Yeah. You're either going to get people who are like, wow, that was the most boring thing ever. And then the other half are going to be like, we're going to kill everybody.
I think with the way my show is, they kind of should know at this point, after 80 something episodes, they should know that there's always going to be those topics that don't always fall into the weird paranormal stuff. But
Gotcha.
I have noticed that when I do, I wouldn't say this is not so much conspiratorial, but like when I do the stuff that ventures off, it seems to ruffle a lot of feathers. So I enjoy having topics that might get people talking. So
Gotcha. Well, thank you very much for having us on. It's been a pleasure.
no, definitely. And again, anyone listening, if you would like to find the book, you can just check out the show notes and it'll take you right there. But again, we're gonna head on out. So thanks to Jaren and thanks to Matthew, and good night, everyone. Remember, the truth lies in the stories we share, the connections we make. Stay curious, stay open-minded. Thank you all for joining us on this journey, and until next time, keep questioning, keep seeking, and keep exploring the unknown. Good night, everyone.